Your translator is lying. The words left Ethan Carter's mouth before he had a chance to stop them. The entire private lounge seemed to freeze. Crystal glasses sat untouched. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the soft jazz drifting from hidden speakers suddenly felt too loud. Ethan stood beside a polished walnut table, a tray balanced in one hand, immediately regretting everything. He was a waiter, not a negotiator. A server, not a participant. His job was to refill drinks, clear plates, and remain invisible. Yet every eye in the room had turned toward him. At the center of the gathering sat Damian Blackwood, the man whose name carried enough weight to silence an entire room. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Dressed in a charcoal suit that looked custom-made down to the last stitch, Damian simply lifted his gaze from the documents in front of him. His gray eyes settled on Ethan with calm precision. Somehow that was worse than anger. Across the table, Victor Hale, the professional translator hired for the evening, laughed nervously. "I think your waiter is confused," he said. He clearly misunderstood. Ethan wished he could disappear. The exclusive Black Harbor Lounge employed him because he kept his head down and never caused problems. He needed the paycheck, needed the health insurance, needed the quiet life he had built after years of trying to escape attention. But the moment he heard the translation, every instinct told him something was wrong. The foreign delegate visiting from overseas had spoken a language Ethan hadn't heard in years. Most people in the room probably assumed nobody else understood it. Unfortunately for Ethan, he did. Perfectly. The delegate had proposed a partnership. Victor had translated it as a threat. A small change. Just a few words. But those words completely altered the meaning. Ethan could still walk away. He could apologize. Pretend he misspoke. Yet something about the delegate's worried expression made him hold his ground. Damian leaned back slightly in his chair. "Explain," he said. The single word landed like a stone in still water. Ethan swallowed. "The gentleman didn't threaten your organization," he said carefully. "He offered a cooperative arrangement. He specifically said he wanted transparency and mutual benefit." Victor immediately shook his head. "That's incorrect." Ethan looked toward the delegate. The older man appeared shocked. Then, slowly, he nodded. The room became even quieter. Damian's gaze shifted to the visitor. "Is that true?" After a brief pause, the delegate answered in his native language. Ethan understood every word. Before he could speak, Damian raised a hand. "Translate." Victor hesitated. Just for a second. It was a tiny delay. Most people wouldn't have noticed. Damian did. Ethan could tell from the slight narrowing of his eyes. Victor finally translated. His version sounded different again. Not completely wrong. Just wrong enough. Ethan felt a chill crawl down his spine. Damian turned toward him. "And your translation?" Ethan's pulse hammered. He knew speaking again would change everything. But remaining silent felt impossible now. "The delegate said he's concerned there has been a misunderstanding," Ethan replied. "He said his company values trust and wants clarification before proceeding." The delegate nodded immediately. Several people around the table exchanged uneasy glances. Victor's confident smile faded. Damian remained perfectly still. For a long moment nobody spoke. Then the Mafia leader stood. The movement was calm and unhurried, yet it somehow commanded the entire room. He walked around the table and stopped directly in front of Ethan. The distance between them couldn't have been more than 2 feet. Ethan forced himself not to look away. Damian studied him with unsettling focus. "What's your name?" he asked. "Ethan Carter." "How many languages do you speak, Ethan Carter?" Ethan blinked. That was not the question he expected. 5. A faint expression crossed Damian's face. Not surprise. Not amusement. Something far more dangerous. Interest. And for the first time that night, Ethan realized correcting the translation might have been the biggest mistake of his life. Damian Blackwood did not speak for several seconds, and somehow that silence felt heavier than any accusation. Ethan stood frozen beneath the weight of dozens of eyes, wondering whether he should have kept his mouth shut and walked away when he had the chance. The private lounge no longer felt like a workplace. It felt like a stage where every movement carried consequences. Damian finally looked away from Ethan and toward the foreign delegate. Without warning, he spoke several words in the same language. The room seemed surprised. Ethan certainly was. The pronunciation was not perfect, but it was good enough to reveal something important. Damian understood more than he allowed people to believe. The delegate answered immediately. Damien listened carefully, then glanced at Victor. Translate. Victor cleared his throat. He says the negotiations remain acceptable and that he is satisfied with our current arrangement. Ethan felt his stomach sink. That was not what the man had said. Not even close. The delegate's expression instantly became confused. He opened his mouth as if to object. Damien raised a hand. Ethan. The sound of his name nearly made him jump. Translated. Every instinct told Ethan to refuse. He was a waiter. He had never wanted to be part of any of this. But the room was waiting. He said he is concerned that communication problems are damaging trust. Ethan replied carefully. He wants clarification before continuing discussions. The delegate nodded firmly. A low murmur moved around the table. Several executives exchanged uneasy looks. Victor's face lost a little more color. Damien remained unreadable. He slowly returned to his seat and folded his hands. Interesting. Nobody spoke. Victor attempted a nervous smile. With respect, Mr. Blackwood, this is becoming ridiculous. The waiter is obviously guessing. Ethan expected Damien to dismiss him. Instead, the powerful businessman pressed a button on the table. A woman in a dark suit entered the room moments later. Bring another translator, Damien said. Independent. Immediately, Victor's expression tightened. That is unnecessary. I disagree. The reply came calmly. 15 minutes later, a new translator arrived through a private entrance. She was older, confident, and clearly annoyed about being called in so late. Damien handed her several pages and asked her to review the conversation from the recorded meeting notes. The room waited. Ethan could hear his own heartbeat. Finally, the woman lowered the documents. There are significant discrepancies, she said. The original statements and the translations do not match. Silence followed. This time it was Victor who looked trapped. Ethan felt no satisfaction, only confusion. Why would someone risk everything by altering a business discussion in front of so many witnesses? Damien appeared to be asking himself the same question. He stood and adjusted his jacket. The meeting is over. Chairs shifted. People gathered documents. Conversations began in hushed voices. The foreign delegation looked relieved. Victor looked like a man searching desperately for an exit. Ethan simply wanted to go home. He took one cautious step backward toward the service entrance. Then Damien spoke again. Not you. Ethan stopped. Every muscle in his body tightened. The room gradually emptied until only a handful of people remained. Damien waited until the doors closed before turning toward him. You said you speak 5 languages. Ethan nodded. Yes. How does a waiter learn 5 languages? The question sounded simple. It was not. Ethan had spent years making sure nobody asked it. He looked toward the floor for a moment. I used to have different plans. Damien studied him with the same unsettling focus as before. Then, for the first time all night, a faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. I think, Ethan Carter, that tonight has given both of us a problem. Ethan had no idea what that meant. But deep down, he had a feeling his quiet life had just ended. Ethan had no idea what Damien meant, but the look in the man's eyes stayed with him long after he finally left the private lounge. By the time he stepped outside, the city was wrapped in midnight rain. Streetlights reflected across wet pavement, turning the empty sidewalks into rivers of gold and silver. Normally, the walk to his apartment helped clear his mind. Tonight, it only made the questions louder. Why had Victor risked altering the translations? Why had Damien seemed more interested in Ethan than in the deception itself? And most importantly, why did Ethan feel as though he had just stepped into something much larger than a business disagreement? He slept badly. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Damien's calm expression and heard the words, I think tonight has given both of us a problem. The next morning, Ethan arrived at Black Harbor Lounge 30 minutes early. He hoped normal work would help him forget the previous night. Instead, he found his manager waiting near the entrance with a look of disbelief. What did you do? The man asked. Ethan froze. What do you mean? His manager handed him a sealed envelope. The paper was expensive. The handwriting was elegant. Ethan immediately knew who had sent it. Inside was a simple invitation. Blackwood Tower. 11 o'clock. Transportation provided. No explanation. No request. Just a time and location. Ethan stared at the card. I think there has been some mistake. His manager laughed nervously. Trust me, nobody sends invitations like that by mistake. By 10:45, Ethan was standing inside the lobby of Blackwood Tower. The building rose nearly 70 stories above downtown Harbor City. Glass walls stretched toward the clouds. Polished marble reflected every light. Everything about the place communicated power without needing to say a word. A receptionist guided him to a private elevator. No security questions. No paperwork. It was as if everyone already knew who he was. That realization made him even more uncomfortable. The elevator opened onto the top floor. Damien's office overlooked the entire city. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the skyline, while sunlight poured across dark wood furniture and shelves filled with books. Hundreds of books. That surprised Ethan more than anything else. Damien stood near the windows, reviewing a tablet. He looked up as Ethan entered. "You came." Ethan folded his arms. "You made it difficult to say no." A faint hint of amusement appeared in Damien's expression. "Fair point." He gestured toward a chair. Ethan sat carefully. "Why am I here?" Damien walked around his desk and placed several documents in front of him. "Because I have a test." Ethan frowned. "A test?" "A simple one." Damien slid the papers closer. 3 translations. Different languages. "Tell me what you see." Ethan glanced down. The first document contained obvious errors. The second was better, but still misleading. The third appeared accurate. Within minutes, he identified the problems. Damien listened without interrupting. When Ethan finished, silence settled between them. Then Damien nodded once. "Exactly what my analyst concluded." Ethan blinked. "You already knew the answers?" "Of course." "Then why ask me?" Damien leaned back in his chair. "Because I wanted to know whether yesterday was luck." Ethan understood immediately. This had never been about translation. It was about him. Damien had been evaluating him from the moment he spoke up in the lounge. "And?" Ethan asked. Damien's gray eyes remained fixed on him. It was not luck. For some reason, that answer felt far more dangerous than if he had failed. Ethan left Blackwood Tower with more questions than answers. The afternoon sun reflected off the glass skyscrapers surrounding downtown Harbor City, but he barely noticed. His mind remained fixed on Damien's final words. It was not luck. The statement should have felt like a compliment. Instead, it felt like a warning. For the next several days, he tried to return to normal. He worked his shifts at Black Harbor Lounge, served customers, and convinced himself that the strange encounter would eventually fade into memory. It did not. Small things began happening. A customer left behind a foreign newspaper written in a language only a handful of people in the country could read. Another evening, a visiting businessman casually started a conversation in French and seemed surprised when Ethan answered fluently. It was as if the world had suddenly decided to test him. Then came the phone call. It arrived just before closing time. His manager answered first. The man's expression immediately changed. A few seconds later, he covered the receiver and looked directly at Ethan. "It is for you." Ethan felt an uncomfortable knot form in his stomach. Almost nobody called him at work. He accepted the phone cautiously. "Hello. I need 10 minutes of your time." Damien's voice was unmistakable. Calm. Controlled. Direct. Ethan glanced around the nearly empty lounge. "You seem to take a lot more than 10 minutes every time you appear in my life." To his surprise, Damien laughed softly. It was the first genuine reaction Ethan had heard from him. "Fair observation. Can you meet me tomorrow morning?" Ethan hesitated. "Why?" "Because I finally know why Victor changed the translations." That answer erased every objection. The following morning, Ethan arrived at a private conference room inside Blackwood Tower. Several large screens displayed financial reports, shipping schedules, and communication records. Damien stood near the center of the room, while a small team of analysts reviewed information. Nobody appeared surprised to see Ethan. That bothered him. Damien handed him a tablet. "Look at the highlighted sections." Ethan scanned the documents. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then he noticed a pattern. Certain translated phrases repeatedly appeared in international communications. Small adjustments. Minor wording changes. Individually harmless. Together, they created a completely different narrative. Ethan slowly looked up. "Someone has been redirecting negotiations." Damien nodded. "For over a year." The realization hit Ethan immediately. Victor had not been acting alone. The altered translations were too consistent, too organized, too deliberate. "This is a network," Ethan said quietly. "Exactly." Damien appeared almost pleased by how quickly he reached the conclusion. One analyst stepped forward. "We investigated Victor's recent activities. Financially, nothing unusual appeared, but several communications were routed through third-party contacts overseas. Ethan studied the screen again. So the false translations were not the goal. Damien folded his arms. What do you think the goal was? Ethan considered the question carefully. Then everything clicked. Trust. The room became silent. They were not trying to change deals, Ethan continued. They were trying to damage relationships between partners. If enough misunderstandings happen, people stop trusting each other. Damien's expression sharpened instantly. That was our conclusion as well. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Damien walked toward the window overlooking the city. The problem is that whoever built this network now knows we discovered it. Ethan felt a chill. And they know I exposed Victor. Damien turned toward him. His gray eyes were calm, but there was a seriousness in them Ethan had never seen before. Which means, Ethan Carter, whether you wanted it or not, you are no longer standing outside this situation. You are standing in the middle of it. Ethan stared at Damien for several seconds after hearing those words. Standing in the middle of it was exactly what he had spent years trying to avoid. His entire adult life had been built around staying unnoticed. He worked hard, paid his bills, and kept his head down. That strategy had served him well until the moment he corrected a translation in a private meeting. Now every attempt to return to normal seemed further away than ever. I am a waiter, Ethan finally said, not an investigator. Damien's expression remained calm. I know. Then why are you telling me all of this? Damien walked back toward the conference table and placed a thin folder in front of him. Because you already understand the problem better than most of the people in this building. Ethan looked down at the folder but did not open it. That is not exactly reassuring. For the first time, several analysts around the room smiled. Damien ignored them. You noticed patterns in 10 minutes that took others weeks to identify. Ethan could not argue with that. The connections had appeared obvious once he saw the documents. Still, he did not like where this conversation seemed to be heading. He finally opened the folder. Inside were copies of international communications, translated reports, and meeting summaries. Certain names appeared repeatedly. Shipping companies, consulting firms, investment groups. At first glance, they looked unrelated. Then Ethan noticed something else. These organizations operate in different countries. Damien nodded. 6 countries. But the same translation errors appear in all of them. Exactly. Ethan slowly closed the folder. The scale of the operation was larger than he imagined. Whoever organized it had spent years building influence across multiple industries. One mistaken translation might be ignored. Hundreds of carefully placed misunderstandings could reshape entire business relationships. Have you identified the person running it? Ethan asked. Damien looked toward the city skyline beyond the windows. Not yet. That answer surprised him. Damien Blackwood did not seem like a man who tolerated uncertainty. The fact that the mastermind remained hidden suggested someone exceptionally careful was involved. One of the analysts approached the table carrying a tablet. There is something else. She placed the device in front of Damien. A few moments passed while he reviewed the information. Ethan watched his expression become slightly more focused. Not alarmed. Just interested. That worried him more. Damien handed him the tablet. Take a look. Ethan read the screen. His stomach immediately tightened. A list of recent online searches appeared alongside building security records. His name appeared repeatedly. Ethan Carter. Languages spoken. Employment history. Educational background. Apartment address. He looked up sharply. Someone has been researching me. Since the night of the meeting, Damien said. The room suddenly felt colder. Ethan read through the information again. Whoever conducted the searches had become increasingly specific. The first searches focused on his language skills. The latest ones focused on his personal routine. That is not normal curiosity. No, Damien agreed. It is not. Ethan set the tablet down. For the first time, the situation felt real. Until now, everything had been documents, theories, and hidden networks. Seeing his own life appear inside the investigation changed that. Damien studied him carefully. You finally understand why I asked you here. Ethan nodded slowly. He did understand now. This was never about a translation mistake. It was about what happened after the mistake. Somewhere inside a network built on secrets and deception, someone had noticed him. And judging by the information on that screen, they were paying very close attention. Ethan left Blackwood Tower carrying a weight he had never expected to bear. The city outside looked exactly the same as it had the day before. Cars moved through crowded intersections. People hurried along sidewalks with coffee cups in hand. Storefronts opened for business. Everything appeared normal. Yet for Ethan, normal no longer existed. The knowledge that strangers were researching his life followed him everywhere. Over the next week, he became aware of details he would have ignored before. A dark sedan appeared near his apartment building more than once. An unfamiliar man sat in the lounge for 3 consecutive evenings without ordering more than a single cup of coffee. Even harmless coincidences began to feel suspicious. Ethan hated it. More than anything, he hated how quickly Damien had become the person he called whenever something felt wrong. Late one evening, after finishing a shift, he sent a short message describing the repeated appearance of the sedan. He expected a response the next morning. Instead, his phone rang less than 2 minutes later. "What color?" Damien asked without greeting. Ethan blinked. "Black. License plate." Ethan recited the number from memory. Silence followed for several seconds. "Go home," Damien said, "and do not take your usual route." The call ended. Ethan stood on the sidewalk staring at his phone. Somehow that brief conversation unsettled him more than any direct warning could have. The next afternoon, he received another invitation to Blackwood Tower. This time he almost declined. Almost. Curiosity won. When he arrived, Damien was waiting in a smaller conference room. No analysts. No assistants. Just the two of them. A large map filled one wall. Various cities across North America and Europe were marked with colored pins. Damien handed him a cup of coffee. "Thank you," Ethan said cautiously. "Should I be concerned that you know exactly how I take it?" "You have served coffee for years," Damien replied. "Your preferences were not difficult to determine." Ethan shook his head and sat down. That answer is somehow reassuring and disturbing at the same time. A faint smile appeared on Damien's face. Over the past few weeks, Ethan had begun noticing small changes like that. Beneath the controlled exterior was someone with a sense of humor he rarely revealed. Damien pointed toward the map. "What do you see?" Ethan studied the locations. At first they appeared random. Then he noticed something familiar. Several cities matched companies listed in the investigation files. "These are connected to the translation network." Damien nodded. "Most people need hours to see that pattern." Ethan ignored the compliment. His attention remained fixed on one particular city. "This one is different." Damien's expression sharpened immediately. "Why?" Ethan stepped closer. "Because every communication route eventually points back here." The room became very quiet. Damien looked at the map again, then at Ethan, then back to the map. Slowly he smiled. It was not the polite smile of a businessman. It was the expression of someone who had just discovered an important clue. "That," he said, "is exactly what I was hoping you would notice." Ethan stared at the highlighted city. For the first time since all of this began, he realized Damien had not invited him into the investigation simply because he spoke multiple languages. Damien trusted his instincts. And somehow that realization felt even more dangerous than being watched by strangers. Ethan could not stop thinking about the map. Even after leaving Blackwood Tower, the image remained fixed in his mind. Every route, every company, every altered translation somehow pointed back to a single city. It was too deliberate to be coincidence. The more he thought about it, the more one question bothered him. If he had noticed the pattern in less than an hour, why had the people behind the network allowed it to remain visible? 3 days later, he received his answer. It started with an email. The message arrived in a private account almost nobody knew existed. There was no greeting, no signature, just a single sentence. "You are looking in the wrong direction." Ethan stared at the screen. The account had not been used in years. He had created it during college and never shared it with anyone outside a very small circle. A chill ran through him. He immediately forwarded the message to Damien. Less than 10 minutes later, his phone rang. "Do not delete it," Damien said. "We are tracing the source." Ethan closed his apartment blinds and sat on the edge of his couch. How would someone even know that address exists? Silence lingered for a moment. "That is exactly what concerns me." The call ended, but the uneasy feeling remained. The next afternoon, another message appeared. This one was different. Attached was a photograph. Ethan opened it and felt his stomach tighten. The image showed him leaving Black Harbor Lounge 2 nights earlier. He was carrying a takeout bag and looking down at his phone. The photograph had clearly been taken from across the street. There was nothing threatening about it. No warning. No demand. Somehow that made it worse. Someone wanted him to know he was being watched. Damien called before Ethan could contact him. Where are you? At work. Stay there. Ethan frowned. You were starting to make that sound like an order. Today it is. The line went quiet for a second. I'm sending someone. 40 minutes later, a woman entered the lounge and introduced herself as Claire Morgan. She looked more like a corporate attorney than a security specialist, but the way staff members instinctively moved aside when she walked through the room suggested otherwise. She sat across from Ethan during his break. Mr. Blackwood wants you accompanied for the next few days. Ethan rubbed his forehead. That seems excessive. Claire slid a tablet toward him. Several photographs appeared on the screen. Different locations. Different dates. Every image included Ethan somewhere in the frame. Walking home. Buying groceries. Leaving a bookstore. The oldest photo had been taken almost 3 weeks earlier. Ethan felt the color drain from his face. That is impossible. Unfortunately, Claire said calmly, it is not. That evening, Ethan returned to Blackwood Tower. Damien was waiting near the windows of his office. Harbor City glittered beneath the night sky. For once, he looked tired. Not physically exhausted. Focused. Concerned. Ethan placed the tablet on the desk. How long have you known? Damien looked at the photographs. Not long enough. Ethan studied him carefully. You think this is connected to the city on the map? Damien nodded. I think someone realized you noticed something they wanted hidden. Ethan looked out across the skyline. The investigation no longer felt distant. It no longer felt like a puzzle hidden inside documents and translations. Somewhere out there, someone had shifted their attention completely away from Damien Blackwood and onto him. And for the first time since all of this began, Ethan wondered whether discovering the truth was becoming more dangerous than not knowing it at all. The following morning, Ethan arrived at Blackwood Tower earlier than usual. Sleep had been nearly impossible after seeing the photographs. Every ordinary moment of his life had suddenly become evidence in someone else's plan. When he stepped into Damien's office, he immediately noticed something different. The large map was gone. In its place stood several digital screens displaying reports, timelines, and communication records. Damien was already there, reviewing information alongside Claire Morgan. Neither looked surprised to see him. Good, Damien said. You are here. Ethan set his coffee on the table. I had a feeling this was not going to be a normal day. Claire exchanged a glance with Damien before handing Ethan a tablet. We traced the anonymous messages. Ethan looked up immediately. You found them. Partially, Claire replied. The sender routed everything through multiple international servers. However, one mistake was made. Ethan scanned the report. A single communication checkpoint appeared highlighted. It was located in the same city he had identified on the map days earlier. His pulse quickened. So the city was not a coincidence. No, Damien said. It was the center. Ethan stared at the screen. For weeks they had been following fragments. Translation discrepancies. Hidden communications. Anonymous surveillance. Suddenly, everything seemed connected. Yet one question remained. Why focus on me? Damien folded his arms. Because you accelerated the timeline. Ethan frowned. What does that mean? Claire answered. The network was designed to operate quietly for years. Victor's exposure disrupted that process. Whoever built the system expected to remain invisible much longer. Ethan slowly sat down. So they are reacting. Exactly. Damien walked toward the windows overlooking Harbor City. And reactions create opportunities. Ethan had learned enough about Damien to recognize that tone. The businessman had reached a conclusion. You already have a plan. Damien turned toward him. I do. That statement immediately made Ethan nervous. Every plan Damien developed seemed to involve complications. I'm not going to like this, am I? A faint smile appeared. Probably not. Claire placed another file in front of him. Inside were records connected to an upcoming international conference scheduled for the following week. Representatives from multiple countries would attend. Several organizations tied to the investigation were expected to be present. Ethan read the guest list twice before looking up. You think someone from the network will be there? I know they will, Damien replied. The confidence in his voice caught Ethan's attention. How? Damien tapped a highlighted name on the document. Ethan recognized it instantly. One of the companies repeatedly connected to the altered translations. The same company linked to the city at the center of everything. A silence settled over the room. For the first time, The investigation no longer felt reactive. They were moving toward answers instead of chasing clues. Yet another realization quickly followed. If they know who I am, Ethan said carefully, they will recognize me there too. Claire nodded once. Damien's expression remained unreadable. Ethan looked between them and suddenly understood why both had been watching him so closely. The conference was not simply an opportunity to observe the network. It was also a chance to see how the network responded to him. And judging by the silence in the room, Damien had already decided Ethan would be attending. The international conference occupied the top 3 floors of a luxury hotel overlooking the harbor. Representatives from dozens of companies moved through elegant meeting spaces carrying portfolios, tablets, and carefully rehearsed smiles. To everyone else, it looked like an ordinary business event. Ethan knew better. Somewhere inside the crowd stood the people responsible for months of deception, manipulated translations, and hidden communications. The thought stayed with him as he adjusted the conference badge hanging around his neck. Damien walked beside him with the same calm confidence he carried everywhere. Nothing in his expression suggested he was walking into the center of a complex investigation. "Remember," Damien said quietly, "you are here to observe." Ethan gave him a skeptical look. That sounds suspiciously like something people say right before everything goes wrong. A faint smile appeared. "Then let us hope today is different." For several hours, nothing unusual happened. Ethan attended presentations, reviewed translated materials, and listened to conversations in multiple languages. Then, shortly after lunch, he noticed something. A speaker from one of the companies connected to the investigation stepped onto a stage and began answering questions. Most people focused on the presentation slides. Ethan focused on the language. Certain phrases sounded familiar, not because they were suspicious, but because they mirrored wording he had seen inside the altered communications. Carefully constructed language designed to create assumptions without making direct statements. The pattern was subtle, almost invisible, but once he recognized it, he saw it everywhere. Ethan immediately shared his observations with Damien. Within an hour, analysts working remotely confirmed the connection. The company was not simply involved. It sat near the center of the network. More importantly, financial records obtained that afternoon revealed something nobody expected. The translation operation had never been the primary objective. It was only a tool. The real goal was influence. By quietly creating misunderstandings between organizations, the network positioned itself as the solution to the problems it secretly helped create. New contracts, new partnerships, new opportunities, years of profit built on confusion. As the pieces finally came together, Ethan found himself standing beside the large ballroom windows overlooking the harbor. The investigation that had begun with a single corrected translation was finally ending. Damien joined him a few moments later. Neither spoke immediately. Ships moved slowly across the water below. The city skyline glowed beneath the late afternoon sun. "You were right," Damien said at last. Ethan looked over. "About what?" "The first night." Ethan laughed softly. "You might need to be more specific." Damien's expression became thoughtful. "When you chose to speak up, the memory returned instantly. A crowded room, a false translation, one impulsive decision. Most people would have stayed silent," Damien continued. "It would have been easier." Ethan looked back toward the harbor. "Maybe, but if you had remained silent, none of this would have been uncovered." The words settled between them. For the first time, Ethan realized how much had changed. Weeks earlier, he had been a waiter trying to avoid attention. Now he stood beside one of the most powerful men in Harbor City after helping expose an international scheme. Damien extended a folder. Inside was an employment contract. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You planned this already?" "Several weeks ago." Ethan shook his head, unable to hide a smile. The title at the top of the page read Senior International Communications Advisor. "You really do not like taking no for an answer." Damien's eyes reflected rare warmth. Not when the answer is obviously wrong. As the sun dipped lower beyond the harbor, Ethan realized something unexpected. For the first time since all of this began, he was no longer trying to return to his old life. He was ready to begin a new one. What would you have done if you were in this situation? Tell us in the comments. If you love Alpha and Omega stories filled with passion, loyalty, heartbreak, and second chances, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story.